students were expected to basically cover all, and I'm not really exaggerating here, like all of almost human history. The standards ran from the Stone Age through the late Renaissance. We would joke, that it was like from Plato to NATO. They're just jumping around, sort of leapfrogging in time, and it makes it very difficult, I think, to sort of develop that kind of sense of chronology that's so essential in any kind of historical thinking.
Welcome to the brand new History Matters podcast. I'm your host, Barbara Davidson, President of Standards Work and Executive Director of the Knowledge Matters campaign. Today I'm sharing my conversation with Sean Dimond, a former middle school social studies teacher, instructional coach, and Director of Social Studies for the state of Louisiana. Sean is now the Senior Editor for Social Studies at the Core Knowledge Foundation, which offers an open source K-8 history and geography curriculum that's also the backbone of Louisiana's statewide curriculum called Bayou Bridges. Among other topics we discussed is why narrative has such resonance for students and teachers alike, and how stories can serve as the foundation for high-quality social studies curriculum. I think you'll enjoy the discussion. Sean, thank you for being with us. It's a pleasure to have you.
Oh, Barbara, thank you so much for having me. It's my absolute pleasure to be here.
I'd like to start these conversations off by asking my guests to connect their professional story with this campaign for more and better elementary history instruction. So I guess my question is, how did you get fevered about this cause?
Yeah, the bulk of my time teaching was in middle school, particularly in 7th and 8th grade. And I had so many incredibly bright students who would just come into those grades with very little of what I think most adults would consider a pretty basic, geographic, civic, historical, economic kind of knowledge. And, I think it's really easy to blame teachers in grades below you or the students themselves or, society or something. But you could actually start to see that there were some problems in Louisiana, and I think this is actually true in many states, with the standards themselves and the difficulty that students would have kind of building historical knowledge when we're not telling them a cohesive narrative, and the jumps between the grade levels, frankly, made no sense. So I could give some real specific examples if it's helpful.
Yeah, let's jump into it.
So in Louisiana, in 7th grade, we would begin the year with the standards with, the American Revolution. Of course, in 6th grade, in Louisiana, students were expected to basically cover all, and I'm not really exaggerating here, like all of almost human history. The standards ran from the Stone Age through the late Renaissance, and we would joke, that it was like from Plato to NATO, and that span was just an impossible level of coverage for 6th grade. But then just note that, the last time they had talked about the American Revolution was in 4th grade. They're just jumping around, sort of leapfrogging in time, and it makes it very difficult, I think, to sort of develop that kind of sense of chronology that's so essential in any kind of historical thinking. And then the other problem, the standards themselves were quite vague, and so it was very difficult for teachers to discern what to actually teach. Louisiana is unique among the states in that they assess social studies in elementary grades, right? The students take a high stakes test in 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th grade and high school civics. And so there was this real disconnect between, a pretty rigorous and difficult exam and pretty nebulous and what I would describe as kind of a broken sequence with no narrative within the standards that I think was really not setting up teachers and students for success.
How would you characterize the difference between your standards now and the prior standards?
Yeah, I would say like maybe just coherence, chronological coherence, that the material moves generally chronologically and sort of spirals. So students return again to similar topics at a deeper and deeper level, but that in general that we try and move in a more purposeful and narrative sequence so that hopefully students' experience in learning history, feels that much more coherent.
I love that. Again, the state is unique in having sponsored the creation of a curriculum. I guess in Louisiana's case, that's just what they do there, right? But it's still a kind of an audacious move when it comes to social studies, right? What were some of the factors in deciding to move forward in doing so?
Yeah, I think it was always the plan. If listeners don't know, Louisiana had created a what I think is an absolutely wonderful English language arts curriculum in ELA guidebooks. So there was this precedent within the department, that we can make and produce excellent and high quality curricula.
So the CKHG product was written for a national audience. Were there things that had to happen in order to make that curriculum line up better with your standards and Louisiana's experience?
Bayou Bridges, which is what we came to call the K-8 social studies curriculum that we developed for the new Louisiana social studies standards, was absolutely built off the bones of core knowledge, history, and geography. And so there was a lot of pre-existing text and activities that we could build on top of. So I'd say, beyond the sort of pre-existing CKHG material that we were able to build off of, there's just some absolutely brilliant folks who work at the Core Knowledge Foundation who have an incredible amount of editorial and publishing experience, especially in the elementary grade levels, where in writing, engaging and understandable text for a kindergartner or first grade student, something that just years of experience working on high quality social studies textbooks that, we did not have in-house.
Step back, if you will, and talk about teaching history to elementary students through narration. And I don't think that that's so common. I mean, it makes certain sense to me, but that's not really my experience with a lot of curricula that I'm seeing out there, history textbooks for young children.
We sometimes think of elementary education as a sort of random collection of information about holidays, which is lovely. But certainly I think we can do better. When we were thinking about approaching, all the curricula K-8, but especially K-5, of balancing these sort of different modes of how we kind of approach history. And, I could briefly describe these modes as kind of, monumental, or how we, present sort of the kind of great individuals or stories in history, and that inspires, children and people more generally. And this is an important element, but we don't want to lean too heavily into this, because then you get into this weird sort of hero worship. 80% of human history maybe isn't monumental and that interesting, and therefore it's not important, right? And then we're balancing that with this just antiquarian history, where just, there is an immense amount of facts and details that you have to learn to make educated claims about history. If you lean too heavily in this direction, it becomes this turgid, dusty tome of, why, this is important, but you lean too little, you don't have the ammunition to make any interesting claims about history. And then, we also wanted to balance this idea of critical history, of evaluating and judging, and, looking at things and with a critical judging eye. And that's certainly part of it. But if you lean too heavily into that, that's very deflationary. Can't remember who said it, but, no one's a hero to their chauffeur, right? If you get close enough to any individual, they're not perfect, but you certainly want to have an element of this. Otherwise, you lean into this, something is great just because it's old, right? Which is also a big problem. So, we had these sort of big philosophical, thoughts running through our mind while we're working on the curriculum. But then we try and bring these things down as to how do you operationalize these ideas, and that's really actually pretty challenging. I can give a really quick example if it's helpful. Please. Of how this actually looks. And so we have a Civil War unit. And within that unit, right, students are reading an expository text about the Civil War, and they're, building a whole bunch of specific knowledge about the Civil War. And that text, we work to try and write it in a narrative way. The materials are organized as chapters, not specific lessons, right, to try and emphasize this narrative approach. And throughout that chapter, they're also going to be reading a few excerpts of different speeches by Lincoln. He's going to talk a little bit about, I would, if I could keep the Union together by ending slavery, I would. If I could, these statements that complicate the picture of Lincoln. And then at the end, they're going to read this letter from Tolstoy about Lincoln, which is the clearest example of kind of monumental history I can think of, wherein Tolstoy gushingly compares Lincoln to Christ in miniature. We're so near to him, we can't understand his greatness, like looking at the sun. And then, having read all these things, the students will then participate in a classroom debate wherein they either defend or try and refute Tolstoy's claims about Lincoln's near divinity. Right? And so I think, having done this, we've now engaged the monumental, the critical, and the antiquarian modes. And I think these things being in balance, that's what I think of as like a solid what makes a solid history curriculum, like balancing
Wow.
these modes and then obviously addressing all the state standards.
So, Sean, what has surprised you about how teachers have responded to Bayou Bridges?
Louisiana teachers are amazing. I mean, there's been so much said about Louisiana's growth in the past few years, recently in the news, and I just think that's so deserved and wonderful. I think Louisiana teachers are just incredible and deserve all the credit in the world. And they've had a lot of goodwill and positivity towards Bayou Bridges. And we also had and have some very intelligent and thoughtful critics who I hope have pushed us to make the materials even stronger. But I will say I think that having some of the immense amount of additional labor in putting together materials that they know cover all the standards and are written to try to be as engaging as possible, while also as rigorous as possible. Just having that intellectual prep somewhat not done for them, that's not the right word, but done with them, they are incredibly appreciative. And I think quite frankly that there's we've had some teachers say that they learned some more information about this material even if they had been teaching it for years, because the teacher guides we wrote are so deep, and that can be a real challenge for implementation because there's a lot there. But ultimately I think it enriches everyone's experience.
Well, I have this instinct, and it may be wishful thinking, but I don't think I'm so wrong-headed on it, that these topics are ones that even teachers appreciate learning about. I consider myself something of a history buff, and I actually used the CKHG curriculum with nieces and nephews during COVID.
That's amazing.
But I loved learning more, so I do think that teachers are grateful not only for having lessons structured for them, obviously, knowing that they are covering the standards and preparing students for greater learning down the road, but to have a little fun. And they see the kids, so much more engaged than they had been in social studies before, to the extent that it was taught. But kids love these stories. As one little boy said to me, I just like using my brain. I like learning stuff, you know?
Yeah, I mean, it seems like the story is sort of the natural default like mode of how we communicate, really. I mean, I think you can make an argument that like, everything kind of having a temporal element, you could break pretty much any process down into a story, or every process is in sense a story. And we're just sort of leaning into that truth, and it resonates.
Do you have any advice, sitting where you sit, for other states or districts looking to create or adapt curriculum? Where should they start?
It's absolutely possible. I hope that Louisiana shows that at least. I think some of it does stem from adopting standards that facilitate having strong curriculum built on top of them. I mean, I think you can build good materials off maybe not the strongest standards, but you're fighting an uphill battle.
And by good standards, can I just get you on record about this sort of skills versus content?
I mean, I take the Hersheyan perspective on this. I think content is king, and that to the degree we think about skills, they're almost an emergent phenomenon. And that my ability to make an excellent claim and show my historical thinking skills about the antebellum South is pretty predicated on my specific knowledge about the antebellum South. I can't just turn the skill and make a great claim about Tang Imperial China, right? It just doesn't work like this. There's no silver bullet. Building of knowledge is something that is just essential, especially in any kind of historical thinking.
I am going to ask you one final question that I try to pose to all of our guests, Sean. What gives you hope about elementary history instruction right now?
Somewhat the reception of the Louisiana materials. I was in Louisiana a few months ago at the summit and talking to so many elementary teachers who said like I used to dread teaching social studies, and now we really enjoy it, and I'm trying to carve out more time in the day to spend on it. To think that we made even some iota of difference down where it actually counts and what the kids are learning in class. That was immensely positive. It made me very hopeful.
To learn more about Sean's work, you can visit the Core Knowledge Foundation's website at coreknowledge.org. This is linked to in our show notes. This podcast is produced by the Knowledge Matters Campaign. You can learn more about our work at knowledgematterscampaign.org. To catch up on all the History Matters podcast, make sure you subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Thanks for listening.